Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the keynote address today that my friend and colleague Marco Almiero is going to deliver. I'm just going to say really just a couple of sentences here, because Roberta's got a monograph in front of her with every detail of Marco's long and distinguished publishing career. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to start at 12. But no, I mean it's fantastic actually finally to meet Marco in the flesh, because I have great memories of working with him when myself and John Furt were the editors of Modern Italy. We had a monographic issue on fascism and nature, which came out, I think it was in 2014. And I think probably the third issue it would have been as a monographic issue. And as Gianluca and Milena Sabato know, sometimes the special issues can cause just a few problems, just a few kind of nightmares actually for the editors. But in Marco's case, absolutely exemplary. Everything came in on time. There was a little bit of delay with Patrizia Dogliani's piece, and we needed a rapid translation, which I performed without using artificial intelligence as well, because it didn't exist at the time. So I mean, a very important issue though that was, as I said, on fascism and nature. And I had a look at the downloads the other day as well, and people are still, despite the fact they've got to pay for it, people are still reading those articles. So I mean, I think a key moment in the history of the journal, Gianluca, and one which I'm very pleased to have been able to work with you, Marco, at the time. But as I say, Roberta knows a great deal more about Marco, and she's going to supply all that information. But I'm really pleased at talking about Vaillant as well, because in one of my kind of second year lectures on the 1960s, it's one of the things that I talk about along with the popular music, the Rockers and various other examples. But the Vaillant and of course the flood in Florence in 1966. I mean, so these are all very interesting moments when it comes to all the kind of ecological nature questions that you look into. So over to you, Roberta.
Yes. Thank you, and welcome to the second plenary session of the ASMI conference on Italy and its environment. And it's a joy for me to share this floor with you, Marco. And because I spent most of my academic career working with you, for you, thanks to you. So it's so it's really, Marco for me has been a source of academic inspiration and also a model for academic collegiality. And while working with them, the categories of colleague and friend blurred and overlap. And I'm sure I can talk for many collaborators and many people that had the opportunity to work with Marco. But besides this personal opening, I think, let me say something about Marco's academic achievements. Currently, Marco is an ICREA professor at the Institute for the History of Science, Autonomous University of Barcelona. But before starting this appointment, Marco worked in the US, in Portugal, in Sweden, and in Italy. And more relevantly for the presence in this conference in Environmental Humanities, Marco has been the director of the Environmental Humanities Laboratory at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. And this institute has been the first institute in Europe with a focus in environmental humanities. And thanks to Marco's tireless efforts and creativity, the center became a globally renowned center in environmental humanities and still is today. But Marco has been a great engine behind the development of the center, and the center became also an international hub for many of us that were hosted there and spent months or years working at the center. Marco has worked on a wide range of topics, so it's a bit hard to list all of them, but throughout the conference we have seen his work quoted in slides. One happened this morning when Julia mentioned your work on the nationalization of nature and the role of mountains. And then yesterday, we recalled your book, the book that you edited with Richard Tucker on the environmental history of modern migration. And I think those are the two major fields you have contributed to with your scholarship. And there's also another big line of research that you have extensively written on, and this the nexus between justice and injustice in the environment. You worked a lot on waste in neighborhoods and conflicts in cities, in the countryside, in mountains. So you were able to explore the nexus between the environment, politics, and conflicts. And I think for this presentation, you're proposing us your most recent research on the Vajont, not disaster, but tragedy. And I think you will explore more the decision of using tragedy rather than disaster. And here, I think it's a good talk to give in a conference in environmental humanities, because you're merging your main interest in environmental history, but also your openness to political ecology and environmental humanities approach. So you use a lot of methodology. You have written this text in a very direct and simple way. So this is in a positive way, simple in a positive way. So I think we are really pleased to have you here. So thank you for accepting our invitation. And this talk is based on his last monograph, published for Einaudi in 2023. The title of the monograph is La tragedia del Vajont, and an English translation for MIT Press, it's on its way, so you can access the text in English too. You have published many other things, but I leave the floor to you now, and thank you for being with us today.
Okay, so you see why you should never accept an invitation from a dear friend, because she will introduce you so well that whatever I'm going to say now, you will think, okay, sure, but so nothing really special. So you really, this is something I have learned. It's important that you accept invitation only from your enemy. They will be very bad. They will introduce you very badly. And whatever you will say, they say, well, the guy is not so bad. So anyway, let's start. I will try to not speak too much. So first of all, I would like to express my gratitude for the opportunity to share my research. My thanks go to the Association for the Study of Modern Italy, the organizing committee of this conference, and in particular to Roberta Biasillo and Patrizia Sambuco, who have been so kind to patiently assist me also with my travel arrangements. And finally, thank you all for being here with me today. Even after so many years in this field, I remain both surprised and grateful to have people who are interested in hearing my stories, even with my weird Italian accent. So thank you very much. And it's not moving, maybe now. Yes, I think now it's moving. The title of my talk today would work better in Italian because it plays with two Italian words, lago, lake, and ago, needle. Therefore, in Italian, the title would sound like Attraverso la cruna del lago. Wouldn't you agree with me that a lake, even an artificial one, resembles the eye of a needle? The image of the needle's eye evokes, for those raised in the Christian faith, the divergent fates of the rich and the poor. As explained in the Gospel, it is difficult to go through the eye of a needle, especially if you are rich. Yet, that narrow eye seems to be the center of the universe, the ultimate gateway to salvation or perdition. Through the eye of Vajont Lake passed not only 2,000 victims, but also the history of the entire nation. You might call it a miracle. The camel made it, Italy modernized itself, also thanks to hydroelectricity. And if some were sacrificed, it is better to forget, so as not to spoil the celebration. But in the Vajont parable, there is no salvation. The poor, those who were on the margins of national history, remain there. For them, the eye of the lake is not the golden gateway to paradise, but rather the siphon of a waste basin that sucks them into a whirlpool of mud and water, from which not even memory seems able to rescue them. For it is true that the history of Italy passes through the eye of Vaillant. It is also true that this history has remained largely hidden. And I am actually very pleased to hear, Philip, that you are including Vaillant in your course. At Vaillant, the gospel is twisted. Passing through the eye of the lake, the rich are saved, and the poor end up in hell. In the context of this conference, I should probably assume that you are all familiar with the Vaillant story, although judging from the extremely limited references to it in scholarship on modern Italy, I might be less confident about that. Most likely, what you know about this story comes not from a fellow scholar or a colleague publishing in our journals, but from Marco Paolini, an author and actor who, in 1997, sabotaged the mainstream regime of memory and placed the Vaillant disaster on our storytelling map. I started with him, with Marco Paolini, in my own book. So let's start from the end, the minutes and hours when the apocalypse arrived in the Vaillant Valley on October 9, 1963. Not far from Venice, 300 million cubic meters of rock fell from Montauk into the reservoir. The landslide generated a 50 million cubic meter wave that, traveling at 100 kilometers per hour, obliterated everything in its path. The villages of Erto, Casso, Castelvazzo, Pirago, Faeco, Dissago, Villanova and Rivalta were struck by the wave, while the town of Longarone was completely destroyed. Experts estimate that the landslide released energy equivalent to twice that of Hiroshima atomic bomb. 2,000 people lost their lives. Actually, they were killed. They did not just die. However, limiting the long history of the Vaillant disaster to the minutes and hours of that terrible night fails to do justice to what truly occurred. While I don't have time to explore all the details leading up to the disaster, I will highlight a few crucial facts. These facts, I argue, demonstrate the extraordinary power wielded by the Hydroelectric Corporation and the widespread knowledge of the risks involved. So, first, the continuous and unconditional approval of every modification to the original plan stands out. The dam's height and the reservoir's capacity were repeatedly increased, rising from 130 to 720 meters. Two notable examples. In 1943, the project was approved despite the country being in the throes of World War II and divided into two. Then, in 1957, the final modification increasing the dam to 720 meters was approved without a proper geological report, only a pending one. Second, the misuse of public utility provisions was instrumental. The residents of the valley were either forced to sell their land or had it expropriated. Adding to this injustice was the confusion between common property and municipal property. Local governments sold lands to the corporation that they did not even own. Third, repression. Repression played a significant role. In 1956, a police office, actually a carabinieri, but who cares anyway. A police office was established in the mountain solely to monitor and suppress opposition to the corporation's activity. And finally, the presence of a massive landslide on the slope of Montauk had been well known since 1937. Local inhabitants, their representatives, and a courageous journalist repeatedly warned of the risks posed by the dam. Their concerns were dismissed, they were mocked, denounced to authorities, and even threatened. Now, one American academic press told me that this story was too Italian to interest them. Fortunately, not everyone shared their view, and MIT Press will publish my book very soon. It's hard not to reflect on the irony that no story ever seemed too American to be considered of global, even universal interest. But let's take this objection seriously. Is the Vaillant disaster merely a terrible Italian tragedy? UNESCO strongly disagrees, emphasizing its global relevance. In 2008, UNESCO identified the Vajont disaster as a key precautionary tale for building a sustainable Earth. Even more compelling for historians, in 2023, UNESCO included the archive of the Vajont trial in its prestigious Memory of the World project. UNESCO argues that the Vajont disaster demonstrates what happens when experts from diverse disciplines fail to collaborate effectively, in this case, engineers and geologists. While I agree with UNESCO's emphasis on a multidisciplinary approach, I contend that the Vajont cannot be understood merely as a technical scientific failure. Moreover, I argue that this failure is not what makes the Vajont story globally significant. In the face of multiple socio-ecological crises of our time, pandemics, climate change, and beyond, we frequently invoke the authority of science and defer to the technical solutions it promises. The debate often polarizes between those who place unwavering faith in science and deniers of various kinds, from vaccine opponents to those who reject fundamental scientific principles. And by the way, if anyone here is from Australia, could you let me know who's paying you to pretend to be Australian, as the flat eater claim? Because I might be interested in that job myself. I think the job doesn't imply any teaching or grant application, just to be Australian. So please let me know. I will apply for the job. But joking apart, this dynamic, this polarization between faith in science and deniers, this dynamic reflects an almost Enlightenment notion of knowledge and a rather naive view of power. Understanding the nature of problems is vital, but it does not exempt us from the power relations that shape the realm of possible solutions. For example, knowing that a factory pollutes does not free a worker from the coercion of the job blackmail. If the Vajont disaster teaches us anything, it is that science is deeply entwined with power, the legitimation of knowledge, its relationship with political and economic authority, the conflicts between competing forms of knowledge and interests, and even the unconscious adoption of pervasive ideologies like modernization, all are central themes in the Vajont story. These themes, I believe, hold universal significance, even more than just a claim about multidisciplinarity. Well, this is the table of contents of my book. I think that all of you can read Italian, but anyway, it's introduction, prologue, the flood without an ark, project prediction and omens. Chapter 3 is the causes of the Vajont, and here again, the Italian language would work better because in Italian, cause means both court cases and causes. Then resistance and memories shared and divided. And of course, some conclusion. Those are the sources that I have used for my book, oral and written testimonies from the survivors, the acts of parliamentary inquiry, the trials, exhibition, films, documents from the Italian Communist Party, and newspaper. Sorry, my mistake. And now, so instead of giving you a quick tour of the entire book, I will focus on a few aspects that I believe might be of general interest to scholars working on modern Italy across diverse disciplines and approaches, because indeed the Vajont was the eye of the needle through which the entire modern history of the country passed. The economic miracle, the Cold War, the clash between the political and the judicial power, the exceptionalism of the largest communist party in the West, the construction of a mainstream memory, all converge in this peripheral kaleidoscope where history, science, and politics blend. Actually, I argue that through that remote alpine valley, one can observe the wider parable of the so-called Anthropocene, the age of humans. Overlooking the Vajont Dam, it seems as we are touching this much talked about Anthropocene. Certainly, The scientific definition insists on the planetary scale of the transformative action of humans, yet Vaillant can function as a microcosm in which we see reflected so many of the central themes of the Anthropocene. At Vaillant, humans have become a geological force capable of moving mountains and putting a prehistoric landslide back into motion. At Vaillant, wonder engineers and as powerful as gods, as reckless as only gods and heroes can be. At Vaillant, everyone seems to know that a disaster is imminent, and yet never real enough to elicit immediate action. The Anthropocene, as seen from the Vaillant Dam, is the story of impending disaster caused by human hubris, a story where omens and signs are never enough to halt in the name of precaution the inexorable march of progress. Perhaps we might get a different version of the Anthropocene if we look at the same story, not from the Vaillant Dam, but from the cemetery where the victims of the disaster are buried. Of course, the plot of this story would not change, would be the same. Millions of tons of rock hurled from Montauk into the Vaillant Basin would cause the same wave and the same death. But looking at this story from the Vaillant Cemetery, we might be less convinced that it is a human hubris and technology that are the culprits in the disaster. Viewing the Anthropocene from the Vaillant Cemetery, the responsibilities of species are narrow to us. On those tombstones are not the names of the great executives of hydroelectric capitalism, or even the civil servants who put themselves at its service. Those who pay the bill for the disaster are not some unfortunate people saying something bad. Okay, I am back. If I said anything bad, please forgive me, whoever is listening to me, okay? And please don't fire me. Those who pay the bill for the disaster are not some unfortunate people drawn by lot in the great lottery of history. Rather, they are subalterns, marginals, communities that are worth noting except as sites of value extraction for the profit of a few in the name of the purported general interest. In my book Wastocene, l'era degli scarti in Italian, in my book Wastocene, I wrote that from the Vaillant Cemetery, as from many other cemeteries of sacrifice zones scattered across the peripheries of affluence, what we see more than the Anthropocene is the Wastocene, an age dominated by socio-ecological relations that produce human and non-human wasted communities through process of value extraction and othering. And if, unlike the Anthropocene, which is so profoundly planetary, the Wastocene is instead embodied, localized, and experienced, then indeed the Vaillant microcosm is a perfect reproduction of it in scale. The issue of knowledge production and legitimation offers an ideal lens through which to explore the multifaceted complexity of the Vaillant story. The conflict over how to interpret and understand the Vaillant Valley spanned all stages of the disaster, from the planning phase to the monitoring of the landslide and the assessment of potential risks, and finally to the post-disaster explanations. Claudio Datei, a professor of hydraulic engineering who was directly involved in the Vaillant events, described in a book the Piave Valley in the 1940s and 50s as, I am quoting, a kind of hydroelectric laboratory. So Datei is describing the Piave Valley as a vast open-air testing ground for a generation of engineers eager to shape Italy's economic miracle. Like the sirens in the Odyssey, the numerous construction sites scattered across the valley lured these young engineers, driven by what Datei described as, quoting, that excitement, a sort of drug, perhaps, that came with designing and building big. End quote. The geologist Alessandro Dal Piaz, who worked for the corporation beyond the dam, believed no other valley in the Alps was as ideally suited for hydroelectric development. To the local villagers, instead, it was the valley of the rotten mountain, and the talk was indeed rotten. Talk in the local dialect means precisely rotten. During the construction of the reservoir, the clash between the two ways of knowing could not have been more evident. On one side stood the corporation, equipped with an arsenal of modern tools, legitimation, and vocabulary. On the other hand, on the other side were the local communities who relied on their deep knowledge of the area to monitor risks. For instance, they recorded cracks in the walls of their homes, observed the movement of trees, listened to unsettling noises, and even devised ingenious methods like measuring soil cracks with wooden sticks. However, we should not interpret this conflict as a strict epistemic clash, as if the local communities rejected modern knowledge on principle for some kind of, passatism in their culture. On the contrary, the local sought to enlist scientists and experts to support their cause, a point I will elaborate on shortly. Moreover, they placed considerable trust in modern science, perhaps too much. In the hours following the disaster, a journalist from the Italian public television asked a survivor why she had not left the village, given that the risks posed by the dam were well known. And she replied, I am quoting here, because we thought they knew better than us. And by they, she meant the experts from the corporation, the state, the professor from the university, and so on. Finally, during the trial, the politicization of science became especially evident. The first committee selected by the public prosecutor concluded that the disaster was, of course, impossible to predict. No one guilty, right? Unsatisfied with these findings, the prosecutor rejected their report. However, when he attempted to assemble another panel of experts, he could find only one willing participant from the Italian academic community, Floriano Calvino. Because of his involvement with the prosecutor, Floriano Calvino faced significant professional challenges that led him to leave his university. And if you are wondering, yes, he was the brother. The two protagonists in this story voiced their critique against mainstream science in a very eloquent way. Sandro Canestrini was the plaintiff lawyer representing the survivors in court, while Tina Merlin was a journalist who since 1959, the disaster happened in 1963, had been writing against the corporation and denouncing the risks posed by the dam. Both were former partisans and members of the Italian Communist Party. This party played a significant role in the Vaillant story, and not just through these two figures. Its involvement challenges the entire narrative surrounding the neutrality versus politicization of science. I will address this in a moment. I think that, these two books should be obligatory, readings in Italian schools. Sandro Canestrini, Genocidio dei Poveri, is a very powerful, very short book. I would really suggest all of you to read, especially if you are interested in STS kind of study. Without any doubt, Tina became the key figure in this story for her articles against the corporation. She was charged of spreading, and I am quoting here, false and tendacious news aimed at disturbing public orders. This is coming precisely from the fascist penal code, the Rocco penal code. In the end, in 1960, the judges found her not guilty, but although they agreed with her and the local communities about the risk coming from the dam, nothing was done. And 3 years later, 2,000 people were killed because of this inaction. The legal action against a journalist denouncing the abuses of a big corporation is a staple in environmental conflicts. Intimidation was, and still is, believe me, the norm in the ways in which the corporation managed the opposition against the dam. I mentioned already the opening of a police station in the valley, connected to the creation of a grassroots committee. The secretary of the local branch of the Communist Party was detained at the police station overnight after returning from a meeting of this committee. As I already mentioned, Tina Merlin, Sandro Canestrini, and many others who stood up against the corporation, expressing harsh critiques of the experts, were members of the Italian Communist Party. Here we have some of them, Sandro Canestrini and Tina, whom we have already met. Lorenzo Rizzato's story is less well known. Lorenzo was a technical designer working for the University of Padua, specifically in the Hydraulic Engineering Institute, which was tasked, the institute, by the corporation to study the possible effects of a massive landslide falling into the Vajont Reservoir. I don't have time to go deeper into this story now, but let me just say that the results of this study were not shared by the corporation with all the actors involved. 2 days after the disaster, Lorenzo took the report from the university and gave it to an MP from the Communist Party, who handed it over the prosecutor and the press. I shouldn't say that Lorenzo stole this report, because he actually returned it the day after. Lorenzo was accused by the university and even arrested because he was considered socially dangerous, believe it or not. With 2,000 people killed, Lorenzo was socially dangerous. In the end, he was acquitted for lack of evidence. The 3 levels of judgment lasted for years, during which Lorenzo was suspended from the university without a salary. The main evidence against him was his membership to the Communist Party. In 2001, Lorenzo admitted that he did what he was accused of. Lorenzo's story is very dear to me for many reasons I cannot explain right now. This is why I dug into the tribunal archives to find the papers from his trial. But the Communist Party's commitment to the Vajont disaster is much broader. The party published a white paper proving that the risks posed by the dam were well known. Its film commission, yes, the party had a film commission, produced a 25-minute documentary on the grassroots mobilization against the judge's sentence. Perhaps, maybe I need one, sorry. Yes. Perhaps no one better than geologist Eduardo Semenza has raised his voice against what he believed was the politicization of science. Eduardo was the son of the engineer who built the dam, Carlo, and a key figure himself in the Vajont story. In 1959, Eduardo Semenza discovered the gigantic prehistoric landslide looming on the slopes of Monte Toc. Nonetheless, he never pointed to any responsibility for the disaster. In 2001, in a book on the Vajont story, Eduardo wrote these lines about Tina Merlin. I'm quoting from Eduardo. The author's political vision led her from the beginning to view the whole affair with the prejudice that characterized her side, end quote. Further in the book, Semenza associated Tina Merlin with the aforementioned author and actor Marco Polini, both of whom shared the same political allegiance that, according to Semenza, impaired their ability to view the story in a more neutral way. Well, I suppose that the corollary of this statement is the existence of an objective approach, free from bias, free from the conditioning of power and economic interests. In short, that God's trick that philosopher Don Haraway unmasked years ago for what it is, a rhetorical tool that hides the positionality of the observer. On the contrary, the Vajont affair shows how politicizing the problem can help address it effectively. Being on the side of the subordinates, recognizing the asymmetries of power and resources at stake, listening to their concern, and exercising systematic distrust of those who have always defended the interests of the powerful are all strategies that would have suggested a precautionary principle, perhaps advocating further research and more controls. In brief, I might say that Professor Eduardo Semenza was both right and wrong at the same time. The political commitment was strong and did steer the ways in which Tina Merlin and others looked at the Vaillant. But the question is, did this jeopardize or enhance their judgment? I should disclose here that I am extremely sensitive to this topic. Recently, an eminent Italian historian, or at least I'm sure he believes he's eminent, wrote an harsh review of our book Mussolini's Nature in an Italian newspaper. He actually declared that he had not read the book, but who cares? If one can publish whatever he wishes, I think it's a good point. But more relevant than this, he accused me and my two co-authors, perhaps I should say accomplished in crime, Roberta Biasillo and Wilco Graf von Andenberg, of being radically anti-fascist, thereby not producing good scholarship. Is it possible instead that we need radical anti-fascists to produce good scholarships? My argument is twofold. First, I believe that taking a stance, specifically listening to the villagers and their fears, was the best way to conduct better science. I think this should be well known. It was because some physicians stood with workers that many occupational diseases were discovered, just to reinforce my point. However, I also argue that the politicization of science did not come from one side alone. Isn't it a victory of class oppression to have convinced everyone that the science and narrative of the powerful are unbiased? Why is it that Tina's political convictions are seen as impairing her understanding of the Vaillant disaster, while the same does not apply to the many experts and journalists defending the corporation? In the aftermath of the disaster, the entire mass media establishment repeated the same version of the story. What had occurred was a terrible accident caused by nature. On this slide, you can read what two venerable figures of Italian journalism wrote about the Vaillant disaster. You have Dino Buzzati and Giorgio Bocca. This naturalization of the event was just as political as Tina Merlin's and the communist interpretation. 5 days after the disaster, the Central Committee of the Communist Party wrote, and I'm quoting, "Paying tribute to the victims of the Vaillant and expressing solidarity with the survivors also means, above all, embracing the urgent popular demand for a thorough investigation into the sinister motives of monopolistic profit and government complicity that lie at the root of the tragedy. The Vaillant catastrophe would not have occurred if the competent authorities had promptly heeded the warnings of those communities." The quest for justice and the denunciation of both individual and structural responsibilities were not well received by public opinion at that time. This is the poster that the Christian Democrats produced to stigmatize the Communist Party's campaign on the Vaillant disaster. They argued that the communists were vultures speculating on the grief of Vaillant. In the face of grief, there was no place for political battles. There had certainly been 2,000 victims at Vaillant, but for some, grief alone was enough, and there was no room to ask questions about who or what caused it. I believe this approach is similar to what historian Giovanni De Luna has called the Republic of Suffering. It is possible to remember the victims, but not to ask what caused their suffering. In the Republic of Suffering, there is no room for politics, because there is no room for history, understood as a layering of conflict and power. Instead, at Vaillant, everything was political. In this story that blends nature and economy, power and science, technology and memory, the victims are never just victims. They are also rebels. The choice to mourn quietly was also a way to erase the many stories of rebellion and resistance that, if celebrated, would have made it clear that people had tried to fight back and avoid the disaster. In an interview conducted for my project, Toxic Bios, which explores toxic autobiographies across Europe, a Vaillant survivor explained very eloquently the clash between two opposite ways of remembering and inhabiting the disaster. Institutions, as I am reading from the interview with Carolina, institutions have done and continue to do everything to divide the good from the bad survivors. The good survivors are the ones who speak of their pain, the ones who move those who listen to them, but they know how to stop there. They know how to remain silent and leave it to the institutions to tell the facts, thus making the memory harmless so that it does not disturb the economic powers that still place profit over human life. The villains are those who seek justice and fight so their dead will serve as a reminder for the living, never to forget what man is capable of in defense of profit. The villains are those who point the finger at a system that prioritizes money over human life. This was Carolina, a survivor from the Vaillant disaster. What Carolina defines as good and bad victims could also refer to good and bad ways of remembering, because as the Vaillant disaster was a conflict about science, it was, and still is, a conflict about memories and narratives. There is an idea that history can be relevant because it preserves the memories of past disasters, thereby preventing us from making the same mistakes. And I don't understand this point because I'm always able to invent new mistakes. So even if I'm learning something from the past, I can invent a new one very quickly and easily. Although I am convinced that history is useful, and not only because it provides my livelihood and I can pay the bills at the end of the month, I am not so sure that its uselessness lies in this freezer function, as if our task as historians were to preserve frozen memories neatly packaged and ready for consumer use. I believe instead that history can serve to denaturalize the present, to free us from a grim realism that turns it into an inescapable necessity. Remembering is important. Those who seek to erase uncomfortable histories of oppression and rebellion know this very well. So remembering is important, but it is not enough to simply place something under a glass case or, more prosaically, in the freezer tub of the department store of our histories. For memory is never singular, is not given once and for all, and refers to different meanings and values, even though the facts remembered remain the same. Rather than freezing memories, historians can decipher them, training us to recognize the memorial regimes that determine what should be remembered, what should be forgotten, and who has the right to tell the story. A memorial regime establishes the official narrative, which more often than not serves to invisibilize and naturalize injustice and violence. Memory regimes are particularly relevant when we talk about disasters. The invisibilization and naturalization of injustice and violence are basic ingredients in the recipe for a perfect depoliticized memory of disasters. And often this mainstream narrative is the one that ends up being preserved through public ceremonies, monuments, and all the paraphernalia that accompanies a narrative regime. That is why the task cannot be to preserve memory in the singular, but the task should be to besiege this mainstream memory with a multiplicity of insurgent, irregular memories. It is precisely in the interstices where conflicting memories collide that we can learn something. It is by analyzing the making and unmaking of different memorial regimes and the ongoing attempts to sabotage them that history reveals its social function. Serenella Iovino aptly observes that, and I'm quoting from Serenella, in the face of disasters, we have a duty to arm ourselves with relentless determination, fostering a moral and cultural militancy so that the fragility they expose is fully recognized. End quote from Serenella Iovino. In collective memory, the Vajont disaster has been profoundly marginalized. There is no mention of it in textbooks or even in key works on recent Italian history. For instance, Guido Cran's otherwise indispensable history of Italian miracle omits Vajont, and thus Paul Ginsburg's rich history of contemporary Italy. Even a volume explicitly dedicated to disasters in Italian history, edited by John Dickey, John Foote, and Frank Snowden, excludes a chapter on Vajont. So I believe it was present in the workshop they organized, precisely with Marco Polini going there. It seems that the Vajont tragedy, with 2,000 lives sacrificed at the altar of modernization, has been denied a rightful place in the collective memory. The story is perhaps too unmodern and an implicit critique of the modernist project itself, inscribed in tones of concrete, rock, and mud. But what would it mean to cultivate and not preserve, to cultivate the memories of Vajont? Which memories are granted citizenship and which are suppressed? What exactly do we remember when we commemorate the Vajont disaster? How can we challenge a memorial regime that first erased and then sanitized the Vajont story? How can we seek a narrative justice by making room for the silenced memories of the subalterns? In my book, I delve into these conflicts of memory, analyzing a theatrical piece, a film, a museum, and the poignant story of the Vajont cemetery. Today, let me close just with one example from this ensemble that I cannot go into in details. Marco Polini and Gabriele Vaci's civil oration marked a turning point in the construction of Vajont memories. With more than 3 million viewers, Polini's show forced the oblivion in which Vajont had been buried. As a historian, I felt and still feel a sense of shame, because it fell to an actor to do what we as scholars should have done, or at least should have helped to accomplish. But Polini's project did not accomplish the preservation of the Vajont memory so often evoked. For if the Vajont has been forgotten, sidelined in the grand narrative of Italy's economic miracle, nonetheless, remembering it is never an obvious exercise and does not refer back to the same memories, much less to the same reasons. In a crucial passage of the monologue, explaining the sources used to reconstruct Vajont's story, Polini states, and I'm quoting from him, "I am tendentious. You know very well where I stand. It is not like I am hiding beyond a finger," end quote. Polini's civil oration constructs a tendentious, biased memory. From this point of view, the choice to transform the Vajont Dam into a theater of memory, the performance was held outdoors in front of the dam, did not only respond to a scenographic need, but embodied the author's choice of field. Not a neutral and compassionate memory of a national tragedy, but the situated and partisan memory of those who stand with the victims, with those who try to resist, with those who were not listened to either alive or dead. Opening and closing by recalling this toxic narrative infrastructure that naturalized and invisibilized the injustice of Vajont clearly places Polini's civil oration in an antagonistic, counter-hegemonic dimension. It is not then a matter of preserving the memory of something in a vacuum, lest it be wasted, but of mobilizing the rebellious memories that have been silenced and that have reason to exist because they are alternatives to that mainstream memory, so domesticated as to be a close relative of oblivion. Perhaps Edoardo Semenza was right about this when, criticizing Polini, he associated him with Tina Merlin, because they both looked at Vajont with their own political beliefs. For the geologist Semenza, this would have distorted their conclusions. For me, this was the only way to distort, sabotage, disrupt the mainstream narrative about Vajont. Rebellious memories can only be partisan. Thank you.